It's a great pleasure to have John Benham as our speaker. He's a friend. He's a NABA member. He's just someone that I really count on when I need help. John's been a full-time beekeeper for the last 20 years, operating 40 plus colonies. He's also been a breeder of local queens and bees from local survivor stock for the last 17 years. He's an Eastern Apicultural Society certified master beekeeper, which is impressive. He was also recently the president of the Heartland Apiculture Society in 2019 and has been president of the Mammoth Cave Beekeepers Association since 2017. He writes a column for our newsletter every year. Bev really appreciates that, John. John shares his knowledge and love for bees as a mentor, as a speaker, an instructor, a volunteer, an organizer at local, state, regional, and national levels. He's one of the scheduled speakers at the EAS conference in Louisville this coming weekend. We were lucky. He's talking about what he talked with us a year ago. So we got a preview. He's the owner-operator of Pure Barren River Honey, winning blue ribbons at local and state level. His average production is 100 pounds per colony, and he has wild bees and sells over 1,200 pounds of honey from his wild bees. His talk is entitled The Second Year of Beekeeping, of Keeping Bees, or Beekeeping 201. I think it's a great time to listen to you, John. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. It's yours.
Okay, this is one of my favorite quotes about beekeeping and beekeeping in general. And it says, the key to nature's therapy is feeling like a tiny part of it and not a master over it. There's amazing pride in seeing a bee land on a flower you planted, but that's not your act of creation. It's your act of joining in. And that's what I think about beekeeping and joining in and being a beekeeper. This is about second year colony management and your second year beekeeping. Normally I do this in 3 parts, but we're going to do the basis of this and help you get through your second year, hopefully. And sometimes I do include diseases and spring management, but those are 2 different programs, so we can do them at another time. We need to understand that bees are social insects, and their success depends on their ability to work with a unity of purpose towards the needs of the colony. And if you understand that, it will benefit you as a beekeeper and your management practices. And this is kind of the thoughts behind my bee calendar that I do. And by the way, I am doing my 4th revision on that. And when I get it done, I'll let you know. And as individuals, if you want that for yourself, if you'll contact me, I'll be glad to send it to you. And one thing about beekeeping is you've got to do your chores. You need to make a schedule of what you want to do. And I use that bee calendar to give me ideas to make my schedule from. And chores not done at the proper time when it comes to bees usually cannot be done effectively later, if at all. And sometimes we can make such big mistakes that we're not going to catch up or correct what we have started or missed out on until next year. Sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. And staying ahead of the bee seasonal progression is, of course, the bee calendar. Now, the basics of beekeeping is always keep in mind that you're the main source when it comes to unnecessarily stressing your bees, and work accordingly. One of the most overlooked areas is the assembly of equipment, including hive boxes and frames. Be positive all your equipment, your hive boxes and frames, are square and plumb. When you buy these, make sure they're that way if they're already assembled. If they're not, when you assemble them, find out how to make sure they're square and you can measure diagonalies, and the same with your frames, because we want our bees to be bees and not correcting errors we've given them in the equipment we want them to live in. I think that's so important. And this is what I really get down on this, it's because you need to pre-plan what you want to accomplish. And when you do your pre-planned inspection, have all the equipment and tools you will need. And that means a smoker that will be available when you need it, and that you will not be required to stop and reignite it. I've always thought that pine needles are great smoker fuel. And once you learn how to operate with pine needles and you get a fire going, you can cram your smoker full of pine needles and it'll run for an hour or so without having to stop. And pine needles do produce a good, cool smoke. And you're doing a major manipulation, and this is especially in the spring, or if you have to change some boxes that are damaged or something like that. I think you need to look for and find the queen and place her in a frame of comb she's on. If you're uncomfortable about picking up the queen, take the queen when you find her on that frame and put her in a nuke and make her safe and put the top on the nuke. And I think what these plastic nuke boxes we get our nukes in when we buy them are great for that, because you can close the entrance, you can put the queen on the frame in there and take her out of harm's way. Because anytime you kill her or you damage her to the point where the bees will kill her, you have set yourself back big time. And you need to just take so much care of her. She's so important. Without her, nothing's going to go. And you can count on that. And the bees have to start all over. And if they do and raise their own queen, it may take you 40 to 45 days to get new brood emerging. So think about that. And don't overstress your colonies, and always be aware of the bees' natural instincts. And small interruptions in your inspection routine can equate to major stresses with your bees. Now, the pathways to more successful beekeeping is when doing inspections or manipulation, and I'll keep saying this through here because I don't think people do enough of this. Make you a journal and write down what you want to do. Get the bee calendar out and look at that and think about what you saw the last time you were in there, and make notes according to the bee calendar of what you want to get done this time and what you're looking for. And we want to design our management to coincide with how the bees live and work together and anticipate the next phase of development they're going to be going through, and that's the bee calendar. And when purchasing bees or queens, this is very important today. Use reliable sources that back up what they sell. And in the long run, you need to strive to be self-sustaining. You can learn how to raise your own queens. It's not difficult. And at that point, local beekeepers can swap queens. You can exchange genetics. People that discover lots of vigor in a queen they've raised, can exchange with other folks and share that with them. One thing that's popped up in the last 3 or 4 years are puppy mill type bee breeders and queen breeders. And you need to be aware of those and make sure that they will back up what they sell you. And if anybody gives you advice, I've seen this on Facebook and YouTube. Now, there's good stuff on both of those, but I've seen a lot of bad advice where they're usually without merit, or they lack key points of information. And some of you contact me a lot with emails, and you'll know that I'm not one to leave out any details. I mean, I type and type and type, and I want to make sure I don't leave out any details and get everything in there. So research the advice and use reliable references. I've got some references up towards the end of this, and you can copy those, or I'll be glad to send you a copy of this entire program in a PDF form. And learn about task partitioning. This is how the bees operate, age-related jobs. All of these partitions and the age-related jobs have buffers in between them to keep the bees safe from one job to another. And this, they can fight off diseases and predators and pests and things like that with this system. But if we interrupt this system, we really set them back, and it's difficult for them to operate and get back going again. So remember, everything the bees do in there, they're doing because of the needs of the colony. I think that is so important to remember. Best management practices. Fall is when we get our colonies ready for spring production and expansion. And that's starting right now. We want to get our bees ready now. We want to get our mite treatments done. We want to assess the food stores and see what they've got now, and then compare that to what they're going to have after the fall flow and see if we need to feed. As far as feeding goes, I'm not going to get too deep into that. But feeding sugar syrup for winter survival is fine. It's okay. It doesn't really bother the bees. They can get through winter fine with sugar syrup. So don't worry about feeding them that. It's not so much the same story in spring because they need the nectar. Nectar has a lot more things in there to make the brood productions and get the colonies healthy. But don't, if you have to feed sugar syrup, don't fret over that. There's nothing wrong with it. And ample stores are 7 to 8 deep frames of food. I don't actually anymore believe they need that much. I reduced that to 5 or 6 frames. But if you want to leave 7 to 8 frames in there, that's fine as well. And when it comes to weak colonies and you need to requeen, and requeening, this is something that if you rear your own queens and you have a small nuke around that I call a first aid nuke with a spare queen in there that you reared back in the spring, and you need to requeen, well, you've got a quality queen to fall back on. The best advice about raising queens is to raise queens when the bees raise queens, because they have all the resources that are necessary to produce quality queens are there when the bees raise queens. And that's normally in our area going to be April through June. After that, it gets iffy, and your queens are not going to be the same quality anywhere after the flow is over. Now, there's lots of good options for rearing your queens and lots of natural, easy options. We can get over one of these. We can go through that one of these days. And if you want to contact me, I can send you information on that too. But when you're doing an inspection, we're always harping on the point to assess the queen. Make sure she's got plenty of eggs. The larva is well fed. We need it to be floating in royal jelly. We want it white and glistening. And when you're doing that, also observe the adult bees and what they look like. Look for deformed wings. Look for distended wings. Bees walking around with their wings unhinged or unhitched and distended or stuck out in a K-wing fashion. Those are signs that we may have a mite problem. And when you see that, you may want to do a mite count. And like I said, pre-establish reasons for your inspections and become a beekeeper, not a bee haver. That's a George Emery phrase. And look him up, George Emery's Pink pages, IMIRIE. Good educational website. Best management practices 2 is applied bee biology. And this is getting back to understand what is taking place when you pull that frame out. There's a whole lot more going on than a bunch of bees running around on wax. They're doing their jobs, and the jobs are related to the other, and they're trying to keep everything in sequence. And as beekeepers, if we understand that, it makes our job easier, and we don't do unnecessary chores that can set the bees back. And this gets back to when you're getting advice on Facebook or even YouTube, be sure to research that. There's a website or a search engine called Google Scholar that's excellent. I mean, I discovered this during the pandemic, and I can't quit downloading it now. It's like opening a door, and then there's 30 doors on the other side of that door. So it's very, very educating. Now, bees are social insects. And task partitioning is what I've talked about a while ago. Those are the separate jobs that each bee does according to their ages. And what makes bees eusocial is the overlapping generations, which bees, the workers are either sisters or super sisters, they're called, if their drone father was the same drone, or if their father was different drones, they're half sisters. Cooperative brood rearing, the queen lays the eggs and the brood is reared by the workers. and the reproductive division of labor. That's the task partitioning and the overlapping generations turns into the reproductive division of labor. Honeybees survive by sharing all the duties necessary for the colony to survive as a whole and then reproduce as a superorganism. In other words, they're all individuals, but everything is done for the good of the group. And the duties of worker bees change as they age according to the needs of the colony. This is something that, and if you do researches on bees, you'll see this over and over and over again. And when you anticipate the methodical seasonal progression, you will reduce the addition of beekeeper chores and the associated unnecessary imposed stresses on your bees. Bees have, a lot of stresses out there, pesticides, loss of habitat, other bees trying to robbing them out. And we don't want to step in and make it worse for them. And that's what we'll do sometimes. So we have to be careful of that. And whenever you're performing splits and whatever, this is like I said earlier, take the queen out of harm's way. Make sure she is not going to be killed. That's just so bad when that happens. And as a beginner, that's something that's really difficult for you to catch up with. And when you're doing manipulations, if you're swapping frames of brood and larvae or whatever, realize why you're doing that and make sure or try to assess as best as possible the ages of that brood or those cat brood or the larvae or the eggs that you see on there. Just take a guess at it. Or as you're doing early inspections, and when this brood starts to build, this is what I do. I take a lumber crayon and I'll write eggs and the date I see them on there. So if I go in again and I need a frame out of a colony of a certain age, I can go back over to this colony that's booming really well, and I'll see the age and the time frame that these bees were created, and I can go from there to help keep the next colony going, hopefully. Sometimes you're adding bad to good to bad, and it doesn't work very well. And honeybees can revert back to certain physiological functions, but they're so much better at doing it during the first phase, the first sequence that they go through that. And this is a survival thing. The glands they use to feed, they turn into different glands as they get older, but they can go back, but they're not as good and they don't produce as well. But in a survival instinct, it still helps. And take advantage and use the peak times of the honeybee's physiological development. The 5 P's of honeybees' biggest survival issues is people, pest, pathogens, pesticides, and poor nutrition. And today it's getting to the point where I'm just about ready to link people and pests together, because I don't think the general public understands the necessity and the importance of having bees in the world. A colony of bee is kind of like a local indicator of the ecological system in your area. If the bees are doing good, then you've probably got a good ecology going on. If they're not, there's probably bad things happening that's not good for anybody. And lots of solid brood pattern is what we're looking for. Lots of eggs, larvae, healthy, and a young queen. And of course, we're going to see this is going to be more pronounced in the spring than it is during the summer. Bees will build according to the flow, and that's when they produce these swarm queens, the big queens. That's when they reproduce as a superorganism. And this is normally during the spring. As the season goes on and the summer gets hotter and the resources wane, then the bees reduce their size accordingly. That's another survival instinct of the bees. And also, when you're evaluating, look for signs of a varroa mite problem or diseases. It's like I said a while ago, look for wings and just physical abnormalities of the bees themselves, including drones. I've noticed, I'm doing instrumental insemination of queens now, and I've noticed collecting drones that some drones, if you get them out of the boxes, have already got mites on them and they don't become breeders. And now, as a part of my program, when I'm going through, if I see lots of drones on the comb and they look older and they look developed, but they're not buzzing and fighting me, I collect them and take them in and look for mites. That's a good sign that you've got a mite problem without doing a mite count. And then if you want, you can go back and do a mite count. Reasons for queen problems that we run into is inferior mating, inbreeding, which happens. Some of these puppy mill bee and queen breeders have way too many colonies in one area. And when that happens, what they do is they saturate the drone congregation areas. And bees that are queens that are breeding out there will end up eventually, they can't help this, mating with relatives. And inbreeding is extremely bad for the type of genetics haploid diploid of the bees. So genetic diversity creates vigor, and that's what produces the best queens. Injury, we do the injury. So be careful. When you see a queen on a frame, ease that frame back in there when you're putting it back in there. And my philosophy is if I see eggs standing on end and then eggs leaning, and then we get to the first phases of larvae and they're floating in royal jelly, if I see those things, I know I've got a good queen, and that's generally time for me to move on. I don't want to risk my queens. Commercial breeders, the lack of genetic diversity, that's becoming more and more. Commercial breeders breed their queens for commercial beekeepers. And these guys, I know several of them, about a half a dozen, and they've got about 20,000 colonies between them. And they're requeening now 2 to 3 times a year. So it doesn't mean a whole lot to them about genetic diversity. They're just wanting to keep their bees alive. And I understand that because that's what puts the food on their table. Disease, mites, poor hygiene, and drift. If you've got several colonies in your apiary and one of them is showing signs of having a problem, then more than likely the others are going to have that problem as well. So let that be a red flag, and check the other colonies for the same problem that you're seeing with your sick colony or problem colony. And age of the queen. Years ago, some queens would last 4 or 5 years, but right now, because of the lack of genetic diversity, I think if we get a queen through 2 years, we're lucky. I had a breeder queen that I kept around for 5 years, but it was a lot of work keeping her alive. And then eventually the bees replaced her. So be deliberate when you go to buy a queen, and ask the breeders about them and their background and how long they've been doing it and what they do to promote genetic diversity. Integrated pest management. A lot of people today are saying that screen bottom boards are not worth the problem. Well, the way I look at it, when a mite falls through or falls off and it falls through that screen bottom board, they're not going back on up to the bees. And to me, that's worth it. I like them. I use them. I do use some solid bottom boards. More likely than not, most of mine, I'd say 90% of mine are the screen boards. And we want to use proactive chemical and non-chemical methods that offer the best approach. And Buzz described earlier the Honeybee Health Coalition. You can't beat that website for all the information you're going to need on mites and how to treat mites. Makes a really big difference if you do it right. And that has everything. It has all the types of treatments that you can use, the temperatures at which they're most effective. And 2, I don't recommend that's listed on there is Checkmite, which contains coumaphos. Coumaphos is it's a organophosphate, and organophosphate derivatives produce nerve gas. So I don't use coumaphos or Checkmite, and it's highly lipophilic and absorbed by the wax. And if you're going to raise queens, it will affect your queen rearing dramatically. And the other is Apistan or fluvalinate. That is a systemic, and it also affects the queen as well. And both of those, a lot of the mites have developed resistance to them because they were used so heavily when mites were the first system of mite treating came about. And this is, again, recognize when you're doing inspections, look for other signs of mites, and you need to rotate your chemical methods to prevent mite resistance. The Honeybee Health Coalition really has a detailed explanation of that. And the varroa mite, the biggest problem we have with that, it feeds on the fat bodies of both the adult bees and the pupa. So it's a double whammy, and the fat bodies are actually like a vital organ to the honeybee. And when they damage that, it makes it tougher on us, and we can't see it, but those bees are dying because of that. And it reduces overall colony vigor, and it transmits diseases. They've come down with 23 viruses that varroa mites transmit and vector, and they only have names for 12 so far. So there's no telling how many they're going to come up with in the long run. And in colonies with brood, mite populations double about once a month. So think about that. And they're peaking right about now. I try to at least do one mite treatment during the peak, and then I'll check. And if I need another one, I'll wait more likely till after the fall flow, and then I'll do a major one after then to make the mite population as low as possible before the formation of winter bees. Now, during the spring, summer, and fall, bees, the entire colony works, like I said, in task partitioning and age-related jobs. Come winter, when winter bees are formed, it's a different ballgame. The winter bees do all these jobs themselves, and when they start feeding brood from their fat bodies in the early spring, they actually become the new foragers. And the new brood that the queen and these winter bees have produced will become later foragers, and they become nurse bees. And at that time, the task partitioning and age-related jobs start all over again. Now, whichever method for checking mites you use, and I recommend the alcohol wash. Powdered sugar is terribly inaccurate. And it has to do with humidity and lots of other things that go on. So use the same type of method for checking every time. In other words, use the same amount of alcohol and use the same cup that you collect your bees with to make sure you get an accurate count from one colony to the other. Now, I'll also always follow the directions. You'll see some commercial beekeepers that don't adhere to federal law, but I think that's their business as long as they're not selling me bees or queens. I don't really worry about that. They're trying to keep their bees alive. And Buzz and I were talking earlier, there is something that's come about lately. Green Science has bought the research papers from Bayer. Bayer owns Monsanto and the other enemies of the pesticide producers in the world. They bought the research data from Bayer to work on a RNAi. It's a double-strand RNA, and RNA has to do with DNA, and it helps build genes on the DNA strands. But if this works out, we'll be feeding an RNA interference to our bees, and when the mites eat or bite on the bees, they will get the RNA into their system, and it will ruin or really throw a monkey wrench into their genetics and reproduction process. And it would be nice if we did have a non-chemical treatment, but that's several years down the road, but it's really nice to know that that's coming about. Now, the bee calendar, the NABA, most of you guys know about my bee calendar, and it begins in September and August. And the colony has been winding down since late June, early July, and will begin to grow again in late August, early September, using the limited fall flow to prepare for winter. This is when we have to do an assessment for colony stores and whether we need to add more stores or not. And this is when you become successful for the spring. If you overwinter the bees and they have a good population of winter bees, strong bees, and winter bees develop with the lack of mites. If they have a lot of mites, winter bees are likely not going to develop. If they do have, if they have a low mite count, lots of winter bees will develop, and you'll have booming hives come springs. And this is when you get behind the bee calendar, you create a situation where catching up usually requires unpleasant manipulations and procedures for you and your bees. This is when you get stung and you're angry and you think, well, I'll never, these bees that I'm not doing anything. Why are they stinging me? Yeah, you're doing something that really bothers them. Summer bees, the bee population decreases, mite population increases, available food sources wane, and robbing precautions become necessary. I monitor robbing year round, including the winter and the spring. I have entrance reducers on my bees all the time. And the reason I do that is because some colonies build at different rates. And strong colonies, even in the spring when we're having a flow, if we have a period where we have a food shortage, where it gets awful cold and the bees are not finding, or we get thunderstorms and they're not finding a lot of nectar out there, these strong colonies will discover the weaker colonies if you don't have some way for the small colonies to guard their colonies, and entrance reducers do that. The big colonies discover these, and even though the flow might start up, when the flow is over in the summer, these small colonies have been tagged as food sources and will likely get robbed out if you don't have some type of precaution to keep the bigger colonies from getting after them. So always do something, take precautions. It doesn't take much of an entrance reducer. And if you've got screen bottom boards, you'll get plenty of ventilation in your colony. Now, feeding, like I said earlier, sugar syrup is fine. I never do feeding in the open. I always do it internally. If you do it in the open, you're asking for problems. You're asking to set off robbing and tagging colonies and them becoming a food source. I do clean my honey supers out in the open. I let the bees do that. But bear in mind, I have a farm and they're about 500 yards away from my apiary. So I don't think I have a problem with that. And if you can't do that, I would be very careful about it. Don't set off robbing. Robbing is a lot easier to prevent than to cure. And that's, there's no two ways about that. I've seen people try to stop it with wet sheets and doing this, and more often than not, they just end up killing tons of bees, both from the colony they're trying to stop from getting robbed, and then from the robbing colony as well. And then it takes a long time for the bees to catch up again. 1-to-1 sugar ratio. This is something to remember when you feed. 1-to-1 promotes comb building and brood rearing. 2-to-1 promotes storing for future use. And also in the fall, if you're wanting to promote stores and you feed 2-to-1, it's a lot less work for the bees to convert that to 18% moisture and store it for the winter. It takes considerably more energy to do 1-to-1. And I've even fed 3-to-1 that I got into them too late and found out that they needed stores, and I didn't really know about it, and I didn't have much time left. Now, in the summertime when you're feeding, don't use aromatics such as Honeybee Healthy and lemongrass oil, etc., because that is a scent attractant to scout bees from the bigger colonies, and your smaller colonies can get robbed out with that. If you're worried about your sugar syrup becoming tainted or moldy, because that happens to some sugar syrup, put a teaspoon of lemon juice or even apple cider vinegar will work. Will keep the acidic, and it kind of forms a antifungal situation in the syrup. Robbing is natural. It's not robbing to the bees. It's just, look, we found some food. When a dearth takes place, and we're in a dearth now, robbing can become excessive with large, heavily populated colonies, discover smaller, weaker colonies, and will clean them out. And I mean, and most of the time it gets to the point where the robbed colony turns into every worker for itself. And the queen, they quit feeding the queen, and either the robbers kill the queen or the queen dies from starvation, one of the two. Some races of bees, usually short range foragers, are more prone to rob than others, and that's normally Italians. But in the United States, our bees have been so intermixed for so long. There's not much out there that is not mutts, or as far as that goes. The only way to tell what subspecies your bee is do a taxonomic examination of the wings, and you need a microscope and a detailed reference to do that. But robbing screens and even entrance reducers are very effective if you install them before robbing starts. If you install them after the robbing starts, you're not going to get a lot of good out of it, because the robbers will figure out, hey, this is how we get in and out of there. And when you're doing hive inspections this time of year, don't linger. Don't expose stores of inspected hive for long periods of time. Put them in a nuke box. If I'm just going to be in there for a second or two, I'll lay the first frame I take out up against the box, and I'll cover it with the inner cover and make sure that way I'm not exposing it to scout bees. But when you see these little bees just buzzing high intensity back and forth across the top bars of the box you're looking at, those are likely scout bees, and you want to close that back up. And don't ever open one up and walk away because you've forgotten something and come back to it, because I guarantee you that the robber bees will find that. And this year I had entrance reducer I took out or forgot to put it back in of a huge colony, and they got robbed out, and they killed every bee in there. And it looked like a cloud of bees were out. A couple of friends of mine down here, and they thought, that's the biggest orientation flight I've ever seen. And I went over, I said, no, they're getting robbed. And about the only thing you can do is just let them go. If you try to get in there, you're going to get stung, and I mean a lot. If you're harvesting honey and you drip honey, or you clean burr comb off while you're doing an inspection, put it in a container and take a wet sponge with you in a little bucket and wipe up honey around the outside of the boxes. And if you put honey supers back on to be cleaned up, this works well. If you harvest honey and you get your honey supers and you need them to be cleaned, the best way to do it is to set them back on the hive they came off of above the inner cover. And the bees will go up through that small hole and clean them out. But make sure you plug up that hole in the inner cover. And when you put those boxes, supers back on the inner cover, and you put the outer cover on, take a wet sponge and wipe around there, because a lot of inner covers have holes in them, and the scout bees will find that and they'll rob it. But the best way to clean them up is, like I said, above the inner cover, and they don't restore honey there, and you can take them and store them for the winter after that. And this is about scout bees. They're always out looking. And in the summer, when the flow has stopped, these scout bees are still alive. They haven't died off yet. They will in the next few weeks, but they're looking for something to do, and they're flying around short range. Bees always look for food in the short range first and then work their way out. So remember that, and remember that when you're doing inspections, every colony around you is full of scout bees and foragers, and they're just looking for food. Now, bees like to fly directly in the entrance when they're robbing and bypass the guards. And this is how robbing screens and entrance reducers help. It keeps them from robbing, from bees from flying directly in. If you've got a 2-inch opening there, it doesn't take a lot of bees to guard that opening. But if you've got a 3/4-inch opening by 16 inches, which is what it's going to be without an entrance reducer, it takes a lot of bees to guard that. And it's so easy for robbers to get in through there. Now, fall preparation, we're going to look hive and queen evaluation. Overall hive health should be evaluated and a mite count done using a reliable method. Please do that. Look for signs of viruses. This is what I talked about earlier. K-winged, deformed winged, acute bee paralysis virus. Bees will walk around and they look like they're shivering. And some you'll see them on the bottom board and on the landing board laying on their side shivering. This is acute bee paralysis. There's 4 or 5 different kinds of those that produce this same symptom, and they are vectored by mites and caused by mites. Snotty brood, you need to research snotty brood. It looks similar to European foul brood, but you don't see it kills bees at an older stage. Snotty brood does. Most brood diseases kill nothing but brood. And frequent mite counts are necessary and should be part of your best management practices, which result in strong winter colonies. You've got to have low mites to get winter bees. And if you want some good reading, read about winter bees. I do a whole program on that. And a lot of my program at ES is going to be on that. Weak or small colony options going into winter. If you don't have a good, strong queen that was raised during the flow, I would have second thoughts about requeening a weak colony. I would think about combining them with a stronger colony to help them. It's better to have one big, strong colony in the spring than one so-so and one weak one, because the weak one's probably not going to make it. And I would not waste a good queen on a weak colony. Never combine a weak and diseased. And if you're going to do this, think about why this colony didn't build. Is it a bad queen? Is that the problem? Or is it diseases? Because we don't want to take a sick bunch of bees and put them with a bunch of healthy bees. And bees feed each other mouth to mouth, and the healthy bees will be sick bees before too long. And if it starts getting cold, there's not much or anything you're going to be able to do about it. Consider if you've got a small colony, but they're healthy, moving them to a nuke box or a single deep with maybe a follower board. This is something you need to research. You can get bees through winter well doing this. I got 7 frames of bees, or 7 frames single, through the winter last year with a follower board, and in the spring they produced 4 supers of honey. So it was maybe something just I didn't notice or I didn't catch, but they got through, and I kept them crowded and kept food on there, and they did very well. And one hive of 60,000 bees will produce 33% more honey than 2 hives of 30,000 bees. And that's a mathematic fact. Fall feeding, 2 to 1, 2 parts of sugar. And that's a good rule of thumb, 2 to 1 in the fall, 1 to 1 in the spring if you're going to feed. But in the spring, once they start bringing in nectar and pollen, I don't feed any more sugar syrup or pollen patties in the spring once they start doing that. I want them to get all the super nutrients they're getting out of natural food. And candy boards and fondant can also be used. That's a whole different program there. You can research that. If you want recipes for fondant and candy boards, I'll be glad to send them to you. Food for winter, double deep, like I said, 7 to 8 frames. I always put some kind of food on there, even if they have 5 or 6 or 7 frames of honey in there. And a lot of the times what I end up doing is taking it back off in the spring. I did that last year and ended up taking off 2 5-gallon buckets of sugar the bees never touched. And that's a lot of work, but it told me I was doing things correctly and my bees were strong going into winter. And establish a strong populated hive with drawn comb, lots of bees, and ample food for winter survival. The best time to get comb drawn is when honey is coming in. And if you're going to put foundation in, make sure it's a strong colony that can heat, because we don't want to spread them out a lot if there's not a lot of bees. But put your foundation between brood frames, not a lot, maybe 1 frame of foundation in a single 10 frame deep that has brood in there. Put 1 frame between frames of brood. If you put your foundation between broods, bees will draw it out symmetrically. If you put your foundation over on the end, they're going to draw it out any way they feel. They'll draw it out for food. They may draw it out for brood, and it usually doesn't work out well. But when you put it between frames of brood, they do a good job of it. And during your first year, be more concerned with learning about bees and producing strong, healthy bees. And the honey harvest will come, because in 20 years, one thing I've discovered about honeybees, they know how to make honey. And if you get them strong and healthy, they'll give you all the honey you can handle. I can assure you that. I had 14 colonies this year, and I produced close to 130 gallons of honey out of 14 colonies. And I'm going to have to find a way to sell it all now. But healthy winter bees is the key to a healthy spring harvest. And when you're feeding pollen patties in the winter, this is something I like to show people. Make sure you feed them after bees start flying. If you feed pollen patties rather than winter patties, there's a difference. Winter patties are mostly carbs. Pollen patties have pollen patties have protein in them. And the protein, a lot of that protein, the bee can't digest, and she has to hold it until she can take cleansing flights. And this is the right side is what she looks like inside. And if push comes to shove and she has to defecate into the colony inside the box, a lot of big problems are going to occur. So remember that when you're feeding patties. All right, let's see here. We got late winter assessment, early spring. When you're in the winter, when you're looking in, make sure it's at least 50 degrees and the winds are calm. If you pull frames during the inspection, make sure you replace them in the location from where they were removed. Don't go checkerboarding and doing things you don't need to be do before the bees are building. And if you notice they're still in a cluster, put them back together and leave them alone. Don't mess with them. And bees, the size of the cluster has to do with the amount of bees, of course, but the outside air temperature, if it's 50 degrees, the cluster will expand because they can heat better that way. But if it's 30 degrees, they contract. So don't assess the amount of bees in there by the size of the cluster. You'll have to correlate that with the outside air temperatures. This in the spring, colonies begin to increase, the blooms begin, pollen and nectar, superorganism reproduction, and pre-flow swarm preps begin. So worry about swarming. I mean, our young queens are the biggest preventative to swarming, and be sure to learn about swarming and taking care of it before it happens. Once the swarm sequence start, then you have a lot of problems and you're not going to be able to stop the swarm. And a lot of the queens I've seen now that people are buying from the puppy mill type bee breeders and queen breeders are swarmy queens, and they have a swarm prone genetics. So think about that. And that's why it's another good reason for you to get into raising your own queens. And feeding should always be supplemental and never primary. Let's see, we're getting out of time here. I want to go to the nectar. I want you to see this about nectar. When we get to spring, we're going to do swarm prevention, rotate brood boxes, note cat brood, laying pattern of queens. Is she getting ready to play out? Nectar notes. This is so important. Present in nectar are protein, amino acids, enzymes, lipids, fats, vitamins, antioxidants, organic acid, plus immune system stimulator enzymes. Most of the people I go to see that are having problems and have European foul brood are feeding sugar. Once the bees start bringing in nectar, I cut off the sugar syrup, and they do much better that way. And I rarely see European foul brood anymore. And high fructose corn syrup is a no-no. Don't feed that to your bees. Since I quit feeding high fructose corn syrup, I've not seen dysentery or nosema, and that was about 14 years ago. So I don't do that. And honeybees provided with natural forage have lower pathogen loads and higher overwinter survival than those fed protein supplements. That's a fact. This is something you may see in the spring. This is white wax will tell you that the new flow is on, and this is new honey. It got brood down here, and when you see this, see how they're putting nectar down here below the brood? What they're doing, this is a sign they might be setting off a swarm sequence because they're going to try to slow the queen down from laying. They may be running out of brood, they may not, but it seems when you see this, the swarm sequence may be underway. So take precautions when you see that. This is called honeybound. This is the same way that same situation you'll see where the brood is dissipating and we got new bees swarming and they're filling this area with nectar. They're trying to stop the queen from laying. They want to reproduce and they want to swarm. This happens. It's called backfilling. Now, the cluster, if you're going to do brood box rotations, this is where the cluster is going to be towards the end of the winter. This is the first of winter. And sometimes if you got a lot of food, they may not make it up that far. When they're like this, either way, you don't want to do any brood box rotations because you'll break the cluster right here. And yes, if they're up in the brood box, the top box, you can move it down and move it up, and be advised, this is going to stimulate then produce more and more brood. And then when you move this down, if you move an empty box up, believe it or not, you can double that population in 6 weeks. So think about that. Supering, I always start out with 2 supers because bees need 2 supers to store the honey for 1 super. So that's what I start out with, and then I go into a rotation. Equipment needs as a 2-year queen beekeeper, you need nuke boxes for making increase and raising queens. Emergency swarms, you need a double screen board. That's a handy thing to have. You can learn about using it. Snell Grove board is a souped up double screen board that you can do many things with. Follower board is what I use. It's basically a partition. Internal feeders, you can use the entrance feeders that plug in the entrance, the little white feeders for internal feeders. They work fine. Set the quart jar in them, set them on the top bars, and just put an empty box over them and feed them that way. And robbing screens. If you don't want, these are robbing screens here on the right and on the left. This is a follower board or partition, and this is a Snell Grove board here. Lots of information available for those. Here is a page full of good references and information and reading. One website I do recommend is the University of Guelph, Guelph. It's in Canada. And go to their video page and you'll see an entire list of everything beekeeping. And they've made videos and they're very good at it. And it's all good information and will do nothing but benefit you. And if you have any questions about anything on this, please contact me. I love to talk about it. I love to type about it. It may take me a day or 2 to respond. I'm trying to write a book, and all my responses I give to the questions are going to be part of that, and they help me as well. If you've got questions, I'm ready. And this is my information, my email and my cell phone number.
If you have any questions, let's see if we have, you can hold up your hand or just speak out. Shall we unmute everyone? Erwin, let's do that.
People, I can't unmute them. They can unmute themselves.
All right.
Can you show that website again?
The University of Guelph.
No, yours.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Why don't we just put it in the chat?
That'll work.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Hi, John. If you have a strong hive yet and you're down to one, you'd like to split it. Is it too late in the year to split it yet? Could you buy a queen, or that be the best way?
I don't think I would do it this time of the year. If you're more experienced, you probably could get away with it. You may not. But like I said, queens, if you had your own queen and a nuke, you could probably get away with it. But purchasing queens right now, other than maybe some northern queens or California queens, they're probably going to be banked queens, or they're going to be queens raised after the flow. And you're going to have to think about the split and requeening next spring, because normally that takes place. The bees end up doing that anyway.
So you have a question here, John. Last fall after harvest, we had a lot of frames that were part honey and the rest filled with nectar. What do we do with those frames?
You can extract them actually and just take that liquid, and I put mine in half-gallon jars and freeze it and feed it back to them the next spring. I use it in my mating nukes for my queens most of the time.
John, this is Buzz Evans. What do you treat with in the winter, in December, and when you have mites? What are you treating with?
I use oxalic acid vaporization. And one thing you need, they say it's a teaspoonful or 2 grams for a box, but I try to correlate that with the number of bees that are in there. In other words, if it was a big booming colony going into the winter, I will use the full dose. If it's not a big booming colony, I'll use a half a dose, because you're just killing visible mites anyway. And you don't want to put so much in there that you damage the queen while you're doing that. But I do think oxalic acid is the best as far as a winter treatment's concerned. Now, another one that some people use, but the problem is you've got to put it in the deep brood boxes, is Hop Guard. And Hop Guard is more works very well in the winter with low brood areas or low brood.
Then what do you treat in the spring if you are treating?
In the spring, I do the oxalic acid in January. I try to wait. This is the weather thing around here. You know how it is. It gets warm and stays that way. Then it'll get cold for 2 or 3 weeks. When I get the 2 or 3 week cold spell, whether it be in December or January, I do the oxalic acid vaporization. And if I've done the long-term treatment after the fall flow, I'm not going to do another treatment until after the spring flow is over with. I don't generally do an early spring treatment. I know people that do, and one of their I know really good beekeeper. He's got 600 colonies. He uses Mite-Away quick strips in the spring because it's very effective and it kills 90-something% of the mites. And you're not going to get into a queen issue because it's not going to get hot enough where the formic acid is going to do damage. And I would say that would be the number one, and Apigard too, as well.
Strips are still the better bet.
Mm-hmm.
John, I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. And like I said, if anybody wants to contact me, feel free to. I love talking about bees. I guess you can tell. And the ones that have emailed me can affirm that I will type back several paragraphs to a simple question. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. We have recorded this, so you can go back and listen to it again. John, appreciate us letting us put it on the website.
Yeah, anytime. I like that. This is a great group, There's 2 groups I talk to that I think are over the top as far as beekeepers, and one is the Nashville area beekeepers, and the other is in Indianapolis. You have very similar groups, and it's nice to be a part of them. It really is.
Thank you. We appreciate that.